This session is sponsored by wineindustry.jobs. Place your job listings in front of thousands of wine industry professionals.
Hey everyone, George Christie here with Wine Industry Network. Welcome to the second session of our virtual Vineyard and Grower Conference, Growing Forward. Now this session, we're going to take on the topic of regenerative farming and whether or not this is the future for grape growers. How is it different than sustainable farming? So a really interesting session. Our moderator today is Stacy Briscoe. Stacy is a wine journalist. She does a lot of work with us. She's a terrific moderator, and she's put together a really incredible panel. So before we jump into it, as is always the case, we want this to be as interactive as possible. So please take advantage of the chat feature, submit those questions. All of our speakers are in the room. They're going to take your questions on as they come in real time. So take advantage of their expertise and get those questions in. And then before we get started, obviously, I want to thank our sponsors. We couldn't do these and offer them for free without their support. So I want to thank Comcast Business. I want to thank Turrentine Wine Brokerage, Vineyards, Orchard Right, and SciTech. Thank you guys for all your support. You've been terrific to work for. And again, we couldn't do it without you. All right, I think that basically covers it. I'm going to hand it off to Stacy and let's get into it. Stacy, take it away.
All right, thank you, George. We are going to get started on our next session, which is about regenerative agriculture. My name is Stacy Briscoe. I'm a wine journalist and editor, and I'll be moderating this session today. And regenerative viticulture is a term that's been circulating around the wine industry for a while now, and it's been touted as one of the most sustainable forms of farming and potentially can help reduce the effects of climate change. So we're going to talk about a few of those points today. And with me to speak to their expertise and experience on the topic is Paul Dolan. He is the co-founder of Truett-Hurst in Healdsburg and a member of the board of the Regenerative Organic Alliance. We have Jordan Longborn, and he is the viticulturist at Tablas Creek in Paso Robles, which recently received their certification through the Alliance. They have their regenerative organic certification. And we have Craig Camp, who's the wine grower for Vineyard, and he is also going through the certification process. And we have Paul Skinner, president of Vineyard Investigations and owner of, tell me if I'm saying this correctly, Sequim Wines? Sequim Wines. And he also has a PhD in both viticulture and soil science. So he has a different perspective for us as well. So right now, I kind of want to start with like just a broad question, and that is the definition of regenerative agriculture. And I'd like to start with Paul Dolan if we can, because I know you've been farming this way for a number of years, and you're also on the board of the Regenerative Organic Alliance. And I know they have maybe not a cut and dry definition, but certain protocols that they follow. So maybe you could start with your personal definition of the term and what the board kind of defines when they're creating the certification program for growers to follow.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the way I look at it is the opportunity is to shift from the current context of farming, which is really much more about extraction, to one more about building life in the soil. So farming in service of life, I guess, is what I would say, which creates a whole different paradigm of how farming would occur for you, and then therefore the actions that you would take. Now with the Regenerative Organic Alliance, now we don't say just regenerative organic, we say regenerative organic, primarily because it was built off of the intention of dealing with some of these soilless players that have started to join into the NOP program. And a lot of farmers felt like that was a problem. So, but it also is built on three pillars. It's not built on just the agricultural or the farming aspect. It's also built on social fairness. So we look at ensuring that farmers are paid well, but also employees are paid a fair wage. It's about good working conditions. So that's one leg. The other leg would be animal welfare. So it's all about the 5 freedoms in raising and caring for animals. And then the third pillar, which we're going to really talk about today, is that of the farming aspect, and just a whole set of standards that have been built on top of the National Organic Program. So if you're organic, then you can participate in this. And then there's a suite of standards that help really help us focus primarily on the health of the soil and the health of the space in which the grapes grow in our particular case. So building the restorative capacity in the soil and building resilience is another kind of shorthand way that I like to describe it. So we're moving into a whole new paradigm now, I think, and we're finding actually Tablas Creek has been the leader in this process, in that they were the first winery vineyard to join this process, and so they've kind of jumped head on in. But there's been a couple of articles that have described this as the gold standard in viticulture today.
So, Jordan, why don't I move to you? And and Craig, you can pipe in here too, because I know both of you have been farming biodynamically for a number of years and now have moved on to this regenerative process. And so maybe you can speak to what the differences are between those two, not necessarily the certification process, but the actual farming that goes behind it, and what benefits you see in one versus the other.
I think the largest difference between regenerative and biodynamic would be, the spiritual side of biodynamics. It really involved necessarily with regenerative farming. There are some preparations, and the timing of harvest or planting isn't really taken into account when we're talking about a regenerative organic certification. The certification also, there's a lot of emphasis placed on the social welfare of the farm workers on the property as well, which isn't something that's directly covered through biodynamics.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask, maybe as a follow-up, what were some of the changes that you had to make moving from biodynamics to regenerative? If you're saying one of the main differences isn't the spiritual thing, was there anything physical that you had to change about your farming techniques?
No, we're still farming biodynamically.
Mm-hmm.
We're still certified through Demeter, and we're going to continue farming biodynamically with the preparations. The largest difference between the two, though, would be the emphasis on the social welfare aspect. I mean, there's a strong viewpoint from the ROC that places. There's a lot of focus on how the farm workers are treated if they're getting a living wage. The fact that they're educated on their rights as farm workers, the right to unionize, et cetera, things of that nature, really.
Yeah,
Thank you.
For me, regenerative was the operative term for me in seeking biodynamics, especially taking over this farm, which had been, farmed very heavily chemically for decades, and had just an incredible range of issues that needed to be dealt with. So I adopted biodynamics originally because this was a framework that I had seen work. So we integrated that immediately into the process, but I always looked upon that as a starting point of exploration for what we needed on our farm. And like George said, we're not certainly going to move away from biodynamics, but I see the regenerative organic process certification as kind of the next step. So taking the next step. Biodynamics, the whole Steiner in the beginning was that was the 1920s. It's like, would you listen to, he went to the doctor with the flu and he wanted to treat you like he did in 1920, you might be less than enthusiastic about that. So biodynamics, as we know it today, was not just what Steiner did in those lectures. It was built upon decade after decade into a much more complex process. And now I believe that we're at the point where we're finding the parts that are actually working. To me, actually, the science of soil now is actually moving closer to biodynamics. It's just that biodynamics didn't have the right words or the understanding for what was working. But I believe it's all flowing together, and that's the exciting part to me. Is this next step? It's time for a next step.
Mm-hmm. And I know one of the other differences too is the kind of concept behind carbon sequestration, and at least with the certification process that we've been talking about, they do require you to measure that. And I know at Tablis you guys have been measuring that and seen some increase in the carbon sequestration. Paul Skinner, I know you have some thoughts on how that works and kind of the science behind it, and both pros and cons to the carbon sequestration, I guess, ideology that people are throwing out there as a way to help with climate change. Did you want to talk about that and your experience on kind of both sides of the extremes?
Sure. Well, soil sequestration of carbon has been talked about for a number of years, so it's nothing new in the science side of things. So I've worked with measuring baselines for carbon content in soils since the early 2000s, 3, 4, 5, and through there. So it's not a new concept. It has progressed. It's gotten a lot of attention in the science field over the last 20 years, I would say, and people have sort of changed their viewpoint about how much carbon you can actually store in the soil, given the limitations, because you have to remember that a biological process like adding organic matter is subject to physical and chemical processes, which in the end become the limiting factors. So you just can't add organic matter and not expect the physical and chemical side of what's going on in the soil to actually moderate and then in the end limit and actually change what you're adding. So I think for me the science is a little bit further ahead than some of what I see in some of the program here, but I do think that focusing on adding carbon to soils where they've been depleted is certainly a good practice. And I had the experience of doing that over 1,000 acres in China, going back to the early 2006, 7, 8 years that we established that project. And I wrote a paper about it and was published in 2011. So there's potential to take land that has been degraded and add organic matter to restore its fertility and to bring it back. And a vineyard is a good way to do that. Biochar is one of the things that we looked at as well. And I think there's a lot more potential for biochar use in the vineyard industry, because we have prunings, we have lots of organic matter that's typically been burned or grazed or removed from the property. Whereas if you make biochar, you can actually put a stable form of carbon back into the soil. So there's definitely things that I like about the regenerative program. I think measuring bulk density is a good thing, because people do not typically measure the soil bulk density, and that's a physical parameter. So when you start looking at the interplay between the physics, the chemistry, and the biology, I think that's where this is going. And I think eventually there's a factor known as microbial priming that's been studied recently in soils, where where actually if you increase the microbial population, you start to lose soil organic carbon that's been there for many eons. And so you have to be careful about, how much of a priming effect that you have and in what part of the soil. And it's also dependent on the mineralogy of the soil. So there's many different aspects. And one word of caution I would have is that you can't apply the same set of practices to every soil, because soils are very different, and because of these processes, they need to be treated differently.
Does anybody want to add anything else from their experience farming this way about the carbon sequestration? I know Paul, Dolan, from both your experience and working with the Alliance, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
Well, I mean, I think that Paul's addressed this really pretty well. That the regenerative organic or regenerative farming is not just about. Well, some of them are making it a lot about carbon sequestration,
right.
But the reality, and a number of us are biodynamic farmers, is we look at the farm as a living system. And so there's all these different interplays that come into the opportunity to explore when you start to engage in farming from more of a biological viewpoint. And so the carbon sequestration is sort of like a result that happens, but I don't believe it's the primary goal of the farming process.
Right. I think carbon sequestration is something you get from good farming. It's just, it's part of the process. I think the operative term for most of us is biological farming, and that's what we're trying to achieve as part of regenerative organic.
And inside of that, it's the soil testing. So we call it healthy soil tests now. And so there's some great labs out there now that have been developed, a lot of them at universities, but some of them are actually public available labs, commercial labs, that have a whole suite of tests that are different than what we used to look at as mostly the kind of the chemical dynamic, the cation exchange, exchanging one cation for another. And that always really threw me. But when they started talking about, measuring the respiration in the soil, which kind of captures a sense of what the biological activity is in the soil, or the soil organic carbon, sort of that which is available to absorb water, so that increases the water holding capacity, but also provides food sources for the microbes. Those sorts of things. There's not necessarily a whole lot of tests that need to be taken. It's about 10 plus or minus, and we're finding that those, I believe, are going to give us some better information in the future. But we're just scratching the surface now. I mean, there's so much what we don't know, but we do have a sense that this shift from chemical farming to biological farming is probably going to be more sustainable. And therefore,
you brought up another good point that I wanted to ask you guys about, and that is the ability of the regenerative farm to hold water more effectively and for longer, and be able to feed the vines. And I know, there was a report that just came out that said that California's rainy season is now a month later than it used to be in the 1960s. And as all of you guys are all from the West Coast know, our wildfire season is now becoming a season. I don't think it used to be a season, and now we have wildfire seasons. So all these effects of climate change and warming and less humidity and drier air is definitely affecting how we farm. So I wanted to get your guys' perspective, and anybody can jump in here on, and I know somebody had mentioned, and I'm sorry, I don't remember who it was, but said that you were able to kind of transition to more dry farming than before. So if you wanted to maybe speak to that effect.
Well, we found that if you get into the range of maybe 4% organic matter, mm-hmm. and you build up your water holding capacity by another several thousand gallons. I mean, there's so many numbers I've heard from 16,000 gallons per acre to 25,000 gallons per acre. I think somebody even used a number higher the other day. But anyhow, you can retain more, have more water holding capacity by about 20,000 gallons per acre. And so for us, that helped us shift about 5 or 6 years ago to being able to dry farm. So now, when you don't get much rain, you don't have the water to hold, and that gets a little bit more challenging. But that's the sort of the nature of it. And then if you don't get the rain, then you can't put it in the pond to be able to irrigate anyway. But it's been a game changer for I think a number of folks to understand and appreciate that aspect.
How about down in Paso Robles there, Jordan? How's it for you guys?
Like Paul said, we're really lucky in the sense that we're in an area of California that receives, around 20, 25 inches of rain a year. We also have soil types that hold water really well. But, in this latest storm, we just received 12 and a half inches of rain, and in parts of the vineyard that we've gone no-till, there was no erosion whatsoever. And, with all those root systems intact, it allows for a lot more absorption of that water, in areas that we do disc because we're dry farming that ground. That's where we were seeing our issues. So, we're very lucky to farm where we farm, and we have that opportunity, but it's not for everyone across California.
Sure. And how about up in Oregon there, Craig? How's it for you?
Yeah, I mean, our rainfall is down here in Southern Oregon is more similar to California. We don't get as much rain as Willamette Valley, so we're about the 30-inch, low 30s. Last year it was 19, but I guess what are averages anymore? But no-till has been important for us. We're on basically 3 types of loam soils with about a third or so clay in the mixture. So with no-till, we have the capacity to really hold water pretty well through the season. So the difference for us, like we're doing a lot of compost tea applications, and we're preferring to do that through fertigation instead of tractor passes. So we're doing a trade-off there, but that's not a lot of water being applied. But this year looks like we're going to get into that 30-inch rainfall category, and if we do that, we're in pretty good shape. We can make it through a season. The difference has been in our older vineyards that aren't replanted yet that have red blotch. Those need to be watered. They are as stressed as they need, and that can't give them any extra stress. In fact, our main goal until we replant those blocks is to take away all the stress possible. So there's a difference in the blocks.
So a couple of you have
one of the issues,
if
I could chime in, I have
definitely.
a client that has close to 1,000 acres of dry farm vineyard. And one of the issues, again, getting back to the soil, is a lot of soil parent materials have different mineralogies. And so when you try to dry farm a soil with low potassium levels, what happens is you can easily create enough growth that during late in the season, when the fruit starts to ripen, you need a supply of potassium that's not available where the roots are, because you've driven the roots down deeper into the soil where there's not as much potassium. So that there's consequences of all of your actions, and the fertility is one that needs to be handled very carefully, because that's a factor that affects how your fruit ripens and the quality of the fruit. So a little bit of dry farming, again, on certain types of soils, it can work fairly well when the clays have enough potassium to release to the vines when they need it. but other types of California soils especially are high in magnesium, and so it doesn't work quite as well on those soils. So again, the soil analysis, as several people have pointed out, is a key.
And a couple of you have mentioned the importance of cover cropping and no-till. And I know that's a big part of the regenerative practice. And I'm opening this up to anybody who wants to speak to that, whether it's, why that's an important part to this, or even, are there ideal cover crops for certain soil types or vineyards?
Loaded question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Easy.
Loaded question. At Hoblos, we're having a hard time embracing no-till, obviously with our dry farming portions of the block or the vineyard. It's not an option. We have to till in those blocks. What we have started doing, we have a flock of 250 sheep that we use to graze a vineyard. And previous discussion, Paul had, brought up the argument, well, why plant a cover crop if you're just going to put sheep on top of it? So we've split our property in half, and we try and focus the sheep on the portion of the vineyard that we don't seed, and we leave no-till for, it turns out to be 2 years pretty much. And then we let the cover crop do its thing on the other half of the property. And that way, we're maximizing the amount of time the sheep are in the vineyard. They're in each block, 2 to 3 times as opposed to maybe once. Maximizing the amount of fertilizer they're putting into the ground. And then we're also on the cover crop side, we're incorporating tuber species that, drive through any compaction that may have been, that the sheep may have occurred throughout the previous growing season. We're using our legumes and our rye grasses, and we're seeing really good results from that process. Taking the best of both worlds, I guess, is where I'm going with that.
Yeah, well, we're in a replanting process, so we're in a 3-year cycle to no-till. So the cover crop would vary as for the first year where it's replanting, and then the second year would be every other row, and then third year to complete no-till. I mean, I'm just trying to basically follow a non-disturbance policy and principle to build up mycorrhizal communities. I feel that is the key to what we're trying to do on this site and have the capability to do. We are you run into things like legumes that may be a possible host for vectors for red blotch, they say. Not that they know the answer to that, but they bring it up a lot. So we are looking for alternatives to legume, which would be, obviously a normal part to build in. So there's a lot of complexities in what you're choosing at the various stages. So we're doing, again, since there was a lot of soil compaction, so oats, daikon, things like that, to try to break up the soils. But it's ongoing. We do a lot of tests every year and see what does best, and working under vine is the next step. So it's a process.
It is a process for everybody. I mean, everybody has to explore themselves, depending on the percentage of silts and clay and sand that they have in the soil, and whether they've got good soil aggregate, and how much water holding capacity do they have. And my particular vineyard is a hillside vineyard that has a fair amount of clay in it, so it has some pretty decent water holding capacity. So what we've done is, and we've started dry farming, and so we're using a mixture of compost, about 3 tons to the acre. We also do a legume mix that we've been doing for some time. We do mix it up with some other things on occasion, for sure, probably every few years. We've also went to a no-till every other row. And that's not a rotational every other row. We used to do that where one year we would cover crop this one and mow this, and then we would switch to the other one. But this time for the last 5 years, we've maintained one row as a permanent cover and the other rows are a cover crop row. And then we bring sheep in. So the sheep are in the vineyards now. So we're looking at all of those things now. I don't think there really hasn't been a lot of testing in that regard, because when you're constantly changing the nature of the parameters of your test, it's hard to know. But it's all sort of in service of bringing a lot of diversity of flora and fauna above the ground, and the same thing, trying to generate a lot of diversity beneath the soil. So as many microbes as you can get beneath the soil, and as many birds and bees and butterflies, et cetera, that want to come and hang out with us. So this new paradigm in farming. It's less about just the chemicals and controlling, trying to control every aspect of the plant itself. It's really more about building health and space into the space where in the space where the plant's growing, and then let the plant find what it needs and get into balance with the system, the biological system, and the hope there is that we'll have healthy plants for a long period of time that are producing really great fruit that's not impacted by synthetics, if you will. That's sort of the general name of the game, but we all do it. We all do a little bit different. Paul, I think are you using cover crops?
I'm testing a cover crop. It's been I've used just about every cover crop that's been around over time, but legumes now have been linked with red blotch, and so a lot of growers are not using legumes in their cover crop mix, especially if they have high incidence of red blotch nearby. So that takes out a whole class of materials, and because red blotch now is seen as being moving into the vineyard in early March, much earlier than we ever expected in the initial stages, because the damage doesn't show up sometimes until July and August. But now there's studies that show as early as March and April the insects moving into the vineyard, and it's feeding on the legumes first, and then when the legumes sort of go away, they move up into the grapevine. So I've been looking for something that is more of a grass and that can be used under the vine, so I can eliminate. I actually live in my vineyard, so if I can eliminate herbicide use, that would be a huge factor for me with a cover crop, and just having to never mow it again is also something that would, because I keep asking for a couple of sheep, but my wife hasn't let me do that yet. But anyway, the cover crop under the vine, I think, has a lot of potential. Craig mentioned it, and we're testing one right now, and I'm hoping by the end of the year we'll have some data to share about that.
Excellent. So I'm going to ask another loaded question, given all this, and I'm going to start with Craig, because it sounds like you, are really started from scratch with a very conventionally farmed vineyard that saw a lot of chemical use. But in terms of the style of farming and grape and resulting wine quality, what are you seeing?
Well, starting from scratch would have been easier than taking over a used vineyard. But, we're not, like I said, started in 2016. At this point, we're not at a point where I would say hard data is in place, but certainly there are changes and very easy one. First of all, the visual ones are obvious. I'm referring to the older vines here. The onset of red blotch and symptoms in the fall is now much later. We're getting better chemistry throughout the fruit and getting it to ripeness. I think the thing that stood out for me is the first year I was here, we were getting yans in the 70 range, and now we're getting them in the mid 200s, and even one batch into 300. So there's a lot of variables here. There's the composting, the biodynamics, just generally better farming technique. So exactly what has made the change is I can't say, but it has made a significant and measurable change. But I've only got 10 more acres to pull out, and then I won't know anymore anyway. So,
Craig, what are you using for compost teas?
Vermicompost. We have from Michigan Soil Works a unit, and we brew. We have 2 brewers that do 100 gallons each, and then rotate them day by day through there. And then we have we're doing our own biodynamic compost. We do, because we're with all the planting, we're using more right now. I'm doing about 220 tons a year. Fortunately, my next door neighbor is a organic dairy with several thousand heads, so manure I've got.
Wow.
So it worked out great.
Yeah. Fresh manure too, I guess.
Very fresh, extremely fresh. I bought 800 yards last year. So.
Wow. Huge. That's huge. Well, it's hard to get it wet because of the regulations for.
Well, they're literally. I call her up, and the trucks start coming over. So.
All right. Yeah.
How about you, Jordan? How about your vine health and your wine quality? How's this farming kind of helped you guys out in that regard?
Yeah, I think good vine health equates to wine quality. And to Craig's point, the one drastic difference that we've seen through increasing our grazing tactic, our mob grazing tactic on the property is how much later our vines are holding out. We do have a lot of virus, a lot of red blotch on our property. And 5-6 years ago, you were seeing these vines kind of start to shut down in the beginning of August, middle of August, and year after year, we got green leaves right into October and November in blocks that were severely virused, And, as long as those leaves stay green, the fruit has a much better chance at ripening that year. So that's the most drastic difference that we've started seeing for sure.
That's great.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to do my last little roundtable question that I asked you guys before. So there's a lot to learn in terms of regenerative agriculture. We've only just kind of scratched the surface of some of the key points. And it sounds like it's an ongoing process too, right? You've all brought up the fact that you have to constantly be doing soil testing and measuring. And sometimes, depending on what you're doing, it's hard to monitor. So if there are people out there who are interested in dipping their toe in regenerative agriculture, taking that first step, what is your soundbite for the best first piece of initiative that they can implement, without a lot of cost or thought, just kind of, what can I do? What can I do to start?
Step away from herbicides. Stop using conventional herbicides. I think that's the first step that really should be taken when thinking about regenerative farming. Again, get rid of the chemicals, get serious about composting and using compost, and biodiversity, I think, is really a good mix of animals and plants is really important.
Yeah. I think it's really getting curious about biological farming. We've been in this old paradigm for a long, long time. and it's generated some sort of significant problems. And we can, I'd like to say that it's bankrupt. There's not much left there. But if you're looking at exploring the health of a system, that's a lifelong endeavor. And I think that it's actually pretty exciting for me. Anyway, it's pretty exciting. Yeah. Now, of course, I'm trying to keep my kids enrolled, because I want this carried on. But I've actually found from my last company that I ran a pretty large company at one point in time after I was a winemaker there, and they're still exploring. They've moved from where I started in organic. They moved into biodynamic. They're moving into more regenerative approaches. They have this huge vermiculture program that they have this really great program for wastewater management in a very environmental way. So there's lots to look at there. And it's just, you get to do it your way. I mean, that's the good news. There's not a way you have to do it. But you can explore it the way you want to explore it, and then share it the way what you learned. It's a win-win.
Paul Skinner, words of advice?
I'd say that try to understand your soil variability as best you can, because as I've sort of said several times, it really makes a difference as to what you can and can't do, and that in turn can affect the way the vines perform. And so know what the limitations are and adapt the practices that you can adapt or adopt, and do so that minimize your expense and maximize your gain.
Excellent. And I know one thing that we talked about before, and I thought was another really great takeaway, is for people to ask questions. Find a fellow grower, a neighbor who's farming the way that you want to farm, and ask questions, see what they did, see who they reached out to, and kind of use the community around you. We talked about the Regenerative Organic Alliance, but that's not necessarily the answer or the end all be all. There are other programs out there that embrace this kind of way of farming, and there are other people who are doing it, and you may not even know it. So I thought that was another great takeaway from our last discussion. Is there anything else that anybody wants to add before we close our panel here? Open it up to last thoughts.
No, thank you, Stacy, for your curiosity and bringing this to explore and bringing us together. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for joining us.